Okay. Hope everybody can hear me. I think I'm on live. Um, so thank you all for tuning in. This is our class for April 18th for PSC 603. There is no PowerPoint for tonight's class. I just haven't had time, but what I am going to do is cover the one topic left that I do think is important for you, and that's capital planning and capital budgeting. So we will cover that here in a little bit. But what I would like to do first is talk a little bit about what's going on with the class. Y'all should have received an email this morning that kind of overviewed what some decisions that I needed to make. We've extended the deadline for some of the assignments. The lab that is on forecasting, that lab is now an optional kind of it's an extra credit lab. So when I send out that lab tomorrow, that'll be an extra credit, and it will have the ability to raise your grade up to by one letter. So if you have a B, it'll have the opportunity to raise it to an A. And hopefully by the next day, or probably by Thursday, I should be able to give everybody an idea of where they stand in the class, so that you can decide whether to do it or not. The grading has, of course, we've changed the grading because we dropped the group project, and I hope everybody saw what that was about, and saw what we did with that. And then my intention is to distribute the final exam next Tuesday, and y'all will have until May, I think I said May 5th, correct? I believe it's May 5th, Thursday the 5th, to complete it. And so I thank everybody for your patience. The last couple of weeks have been pretty rough, but especially the last 72 hours or so, but getting through it and trying to get everything else, trying to take care of it. Thank you, Jillian, for the information. Looks like everybody's having a little bit of struggle here today. So what I want to do is talk about capital planning and capital budgeting. So there's two sides to financial management and budgeting in most levels of government. And the first side is operations. And that's what we've spent a lot of our time talking about in this course. And operations comprise, from a standpoint of the share of financial resources, they comprise the bulk share of financial resources that are used to run governments or run nonprofit operations. Of course, the most significant of that being payroll and benefits. If you look at a budget, typically for a general government operating fund, general fund of a local government, you'll see that at least half, if not more, of their total budget's tied up in pay and benefits for their employees, because the work we do in most areas is highly labor intensive, particularly when it comes to delivery of public services. Then there's other operating expenses, there's debt service, and so on and so forth. But there is that other share, which is also important, which involves capital. And capital, what we're really talking about are the assets, the physical assets, whether they be buildings, infrastructure, or equipment that governments use to provide services. They're the physical aspect of that. And it is something that is very important for governments to have. And they have to maintain them. They also have to expand them, modify them, and replace them. And there are times where they are decommissioned and are eliminated. There are two ways to look at capital. One that I'll spend just a little bit of time is from the balance sheet perspective. Physical assets, like any business, count as an asset. So the value of your buildings, the value of your other infrastructure, value of equipment, that is considered for accounting purposes an asset. So when you look at a balance sheet, I think I showed you a balance sheet from a financial report earlier in the semester. What you will see is that one of the largest asset classes or groups of assets is equipment, buildings, and infrastructure. And this asset is valued, it has a value to it. And then that value, of course, changes over time. It loses value or depreciates. And that depreciation is taken off and the value is reduced. There was an effort about 20 years ago done by GASB to try to encourage, to make it so that local governments and state governments did a better job of trying to capture the life cycle or the life expectancy of these assets. And it can be anything from a fire truck, a trash truck, to roads and sidewalks themselves, and of course, buildings. In that all of these pieces of capital have in their own right a certain life expectancy. For a fire truck, the average life expectancy on a fire truck in terms of active service, frontline service, is about 10 years. And then it has about 5 or 6 years that it can be used as a reserve vehicle. Now, that used to be 30 or 40 years, but the nature of the equipment has changed dramatically. Streets have a certain life expectancy, usually about 20 to 30 years. Some types of other infrastructure may have a life expectancy of 50 years. Typically, equipment or infrastructure life expectancy typically rounds out at about 50 to 60 years. Even if it is used longer, for the purposes of this exercise, what GASB wanted to do was encourage local governments to try to be in a position to save money so that they would be, or put money aside so that they would be able to appropriately have funds available in the future to cover the cost of maintaining, renovating, or replacing these capital assets. So they began to require that local governments show depreciation. That was done starting in the early 2000s. I actually was working at an internship at that time, and we had to go out and actually do a full accounting of our infrastructure. And that meant everything from going into our warehouse and counting everything to make sure we had proper inventory, to actually going along the roads that the city maintained and the sidewalks the city maintained with a rolling measure, and actually measuring out their length so that we could confirm the number of lane miles of roads that we had. And then you equated a value and you put that value in there, and that was your asset value. But these assets, we add assets through expansion or replacement. We depreciate them through their continued use, and it's typically done on a pro rata share, which means you take, for example, like if an asset has a 50-year life expectancy, you would deduct 1/50th of its value each year. And then those assets that you get rid of, you could possibly sell land. Land's another major asset that governments have a lot of. It's considered capital. You may have vehicles that you surplus, like old police cars, or that you may donate to a group. We donate, sometimes we'll donate a fire truck to the local community college to use in their firefighter training program. And that, of course, these adjustments are made each year. So that's more the balance sheet side. When it comes to the budgeting side, capital is handled differently depending on the jurisdiction that you're in. But there are a couple of fundamental characteristics that are consistent with how capital is handled. First of all, a jurisdiction will have set guidelines for what qualifies as capital for the purposes of budgeting. And I'll use our here in Rocky Mount as an example, but they can be different depending on where you are. And a lot of smaller jurisdictions have smaller values. A lot of larger jurisdictions have larger values. They need to be updated on a regular basis to keep up with inflation. Otherwise, you have equipment that makes no sense, that was bought, say, 20 or 30 years ago, that makes no sense. Like in some places, they'll look at office equipment and they'll take a calculator, like a tabletop calculator for those of you who use them, and they'll consider that a capital asset. Well, it's not. for our purposes in Rocky Mount, our valuation is $1,000, minimum cost of $1,000, and that it has at least 1 year of continuous use. So it needs to be something that's not consumable that costs more than $1,000. So computers would be an example of a capital asset. Most computers that we use, like my Surface and such, cost well over $1,000. And sometimes there are certain provisions given for equipment and for other types of equipment and other things. But for example, you may have a fleet maintenance office or a garage. Yes, a durable good, absolutely correct, John. It does need to be a durable good. Non-durable goods would not be construed as capital. But at the same time, there's also the dollar value. For example, let's say you have a maintenance office, a maintenance shop in your operation. You're responsible for maintaining some of your own facilities. The small tools like your pliers, your hammer, your screwdrivers, those would not necessarily be considered capital. You wouldn't pay for them with a capital account. I'll explain for that later. And you wouldn't value them as an asset, even though they are a durable good. They could last decades, if not centuries. But the reality is that you have to have both. It has to be durable and it has to be of a certain value. So those are the characteristics that you have to determine from a budgeting perspective to determine whether an expenditure needs to be paid for with an operating account or a capital account. And typically in your chart of accounts, which I've shown you through the lab exercises, capital accounts are numbered differently. So for example, in Rocky Mount, we have the object codes. All the revenues start with a 3. It's a 6-digit number and it starts with a 3. All the operating revenue codes start with a 4. And then all the capital expenditure codes start with a 5. They're also in a separate category for capital. You may have seen that in some of the previous exercises in the lab. So you would budget for them as part of your budget, but you would budget them, and you would budget them based on the department or the division in which they're being expended. And you also have to be mindful with respect to fund, because if you use fund accounting, like if you operate utility systems, they either belong to general government or they belong specifically as an asset to the given utility. So they may be something in electric or in gas, like a substation. The transformers and those pieces of capital equipment, which can run well over $1 million, belong to the electric fund. But on the gas side, a gas service truck may belong to the gas fund. And of course, police cars belong to the general fund. So that's done as part of budgeting. It is the most subject to volatility because in a lot of cases, operating funds are less adjustable or have less potential to be reduced. We often you may hear it referred to as the difference between discretionary and non-discretionary spending. Certain things, even if by statute they are discretionary, don't necessarily mean that from a political perspective and an operational perspective that they are discretionary. For example, when you look at payroll, it's very unlikely, unless you have dramatic reductions in employment, dramatic reductions in revenue, that you are going to lay off employees. There were some jurisdictions that did this, and there were some states that have done this. States have done it from time to time, more so than localities. The most recent example would have been during COVID. There were some layoffs that occurred, particularly in school systems and in some other particular functions of government. But police officers, firefighters, other key positions a lot of times, and also support staff aren't subject to those layoffs. Now, they may do some other tactics to reduce pay costs. But generally speaking, from a political perspective, salaries and benefits are not necessarily discretionary when it actually comes to balancing budgets. Your operating expenses are not necessarily discretionary, except in a few key areas, like travel or trying to cut a little bit here and there in office supplies or in some other expenditures. Then you also have your obligations like debt service and contract requirements, and those are non-discretionary. In fact, you have to budget for them first when you're balancing. But when we get to capital, a lot of times capital budgets are entirely discretionary. Unless you are legally required to perform some kind of capital action, like let's say you're a county government and you've been told that your jail has to be condemned and that you have to build a new one. That legal mandate may make a jail to some degree non-discretionary, but obviously the amount that you spend and how you build it, there are some discretionary abilities there. But the reality is that capital budgets could be reduced or cut entirely in some cases. One example would be Mecklenburg County, after the 2008 financial crisis, actually eliminated their capital budget for a year or two because they needed to maintain operations and they had seen a dramatic reduction in revenues. So those type of decisions can be made. The problem, of course, when you make those kind of decisions is that honestly, you're kicking the can down the road. And we've talked about this in other examples, but that's an example of a deferral that does not serve the long-term interest of your organization. I'm dealing with that right now here in Rocky Mount. In response to COVID, we had to make some budget reductions, not only in a future budget year, but in the current fiscal year we were operating at that time, fiscal year 2020. The political decision was made to not spend money on the replacement of vehicles and rolling stock or heavy equipment like fire trucks, trash trucks, and such. So we ended up making the decision to not spend that money for 2 fiscal years. And then when we prepared the budget for this current fiscal year, we kind of wanted to start small. We have a considerable backlog of deferred vehicle replacements that need to take place, vehicles that are costing us too much in repair, vehicles that are down too often. And so we're having to come back with our proposed budget for next year with a sizable increase in capital expenditures for vehicle and rolling stock replacement. So that's a significant expense, and it's going to have to be a significant expense made over several years in order to be able to adjust for what we are dealing with. So capital budgeting, of course, is done on an annual basis or every 2 years if you use biennial budgeting. There is also a process that I believe the text talks about known as the Capital Improvement Program. And this is a longer term view of capital spending that a lot of governments get involved in. And it takes on different forms. It's called the Transportation Improvement Plan when you're dealing with transportation infrastructure. But it's with the idea that more significant capital projects, and we're not talking about all capital projects, there's typically a higher threshold to be a CIP or a TIP, also known as a TIP project. These are projects that have even longer useful life, typically useful life of at least 3 to 5 years, and have a higher spending threshold of at least $50,000, in some cases $100,000, depending on the jurisdiction. But these projects are really getting down to the core equipment infrastructure that you need in order to provide service. And these are typically planned out on a 5-year basis. And the reason you do this is because you want to have for 2 reasons primarily, or 3. The first is that you want to have an idea of what your capital spending is going to look like over a long period of time, because capital spending is not as much with operating expenditures. Operating expenditures fluctuate, but you're spending it on the same things over time. With capital, you may have one project come up, and it goes away, and it has to be replaced with another project. The goal, if you're doing it right, is to balance out your capital spending, build in a little bit of an escalation for inflation, or right now a huge escalation for inflation, and have kind of an even plane of spending on capital over a period of time. So that's number one. Number two is a lot of these projects take more than 1 year to complete. For example, if we were to build a building and we didn't own the land, well, your first year is going to be tied up in acquiring land and then doing the planning and the design on the building. So you would have there, in those cases, a 2-year project. You would have the first year, you would have to set aside plan money for acquisition and design. And then the second year, you would have construction. So you got to plan it out a little differently. And then the third is when you're talking about capital at the state and local levels, we're not talking about the federal government here, we're talking about state and local levels. That is when another source of revenue that you have available for is financing. We talked about debt already, but again, you're wanting to plan out your debt. Much like you're wanting to plan out what you're doing, you also want to plan out your debt, because with debt comes debt service. There's certain limitations and such, and you want to know what these limits are in advance. Ideally, when you put together a capital program, the idea being that the first 3 years of that program are pretty much set in stone. You have a very strong idea that you know what you're going to be doing for the next 3 years. Years 4 and 5, there's some certainty to it, but there's the reality that programs may change because priorities may change. You may have certain situations come up that require immediate attention, so you may have to move projects out years 4 and 5. There are some jurisdictions out there, and there's actually some state grant requirements that ask for 10-year capital plans. I will tell you right now, years 6 through 10 on a capital plan are nice to have, but there's no guarantee any of that's going to happen. And it's nice to kind of do that kind of planning, but the reality is that what that future year, say 6 or 7 years out, looks like when it actually comes up to being the most current year or a year out from now, there's going to be dramatic differences with respect to that. So that's what I wanted to share with respect to capital planning and capital budgeting. And I'll be happy, if anybody's got any questions with respect to that topic, I'll be happy to answer them now.
I just want to make sure I understand the chart of accounts
Okay.
concept. So that's like, does the chart of accounts that comes from the like legal part of the budget, that's like you have this much money this year to spend on these kinds of either capital or operations? Like, is it more like from the beginning, it's like, this is how much you have to spend, or is it more about like tracking what has already been spent? Is it not like already designated, like you have this much for capital stuff and then you have to divvy it up, or is it just more like so you know by tracking?
Well, it depends on how closely a government plans out its original budget. So under North Carolina statute, and in accordance with our auditors, we are required to balance out for the year with respect to budget and actual. In other words, our budgets have to be greater than or equal to actual spending at the fund level, first of all, then the department level, then the division level, and lastly, the category. So like the total salary budget, which includes multiple accounts, each with its own account number, the sum of that category, whatever the budget is at the end of the fiscal year, has to be as much or greater than how much we've actually spent. And what happens in a lot of jurisdictions, particularly small and medium-sized jurisdictions, is that when they present the budget to City Council, we do this here in Rocky Mount, the budget is presented by individual account. It's known as a line item budget. So each line item, like office supplies, tools, and then also with salary, you may have full-time salary, part-time, overtime, whatever the case may be. Each of those accounts is identified, and the amount of money that we're starting off having for that year is shown. And they see the difference compared to what was adopted the prior year. So they see how much is increased or decreased. Some jurisdictions don't do it to that level. Larger jurisdictions will show it by division and then by category within the division. But they won't, when they're talking with elected officials, they won't show the individual line items. But there's differences of opinion. When budgets are adopted, However, whatever those levels that are adopted are set. And as it talks about in the book, there's two ways you can adjust the budget. The first way is what's known as an amendment. And that amendment serves to increase or decrease the overall level of expenditures in a given fund. So you have to have a corresponding increase and decrease in revenue and a corresponding increase and decrease in expenditures, and they have to balance because the budget has to remain balanced with respect to revenue to expenditures. So, for example, let's say the most recent amendment I did was for a grant that was received by our Children's Museum, which is a division of the Parks Department. They received a grant from the state for $50,000. I prepared an amendment to increase their revenue, to increase the general fund's revenue by $50,000, just particular line item code and revenues for grants from the state that I use. I increased that by $50,000. And then I increased their expenditure. I increased an expenditure line that they had for the expenses associated with this grant by $50,000. Those adjustments that occur are reflected in what's known as the revised or amended budget. You start off with the adopted amount, and then you have the revised or amended amount. Now, amendments or increases or decreases in overall appropriation levels by fund have to be approved by City Council or County Commission in North Carolina. So they require a vote of the elected body. They have to approve it. Transfers, which is the second type of change to a budget, are when you're not increasing the overall appropriation level or the overall revenue level. All you're doing is moving money in a fund between one count and another. So the best example I can give to that is this. Let's say I have some vacancies in the fire department. And in order to accommodate these vacancies and being able to provide service, they're asking their existing full-time staff to take on additional overtime. So in order to compensate the overtime, they're paying more of their overtime account than perhaps they had budgeted, but they're saving money in full-time because they have the vacancies. So let's say they come to me and say, we're going to need $50,000 to cover overtime, but we're going to have $50,000 in savings. I would do a transfer to transfer money from the full-time account in the fire department to the part-time account in the fire department. That would reflect their revised budgets, but it does not overall increase the level of appropriations for the general fund. And that's an example of a transfer. And in most jurisdictions, transfers can be approved by the chief administrative officer, i.e. the city manager or city or county manager. And they go through an internal review process, but they do not require council approval. Are there any other questions? Okay. Well, that's what I had to share for tonight. Are there any other questions that anybody has with respect to the course?
Professor Hunter, I just want to make sure I understand the email that you sent this morning.
Okay.
So on the email, it says the final assignment. Is that the exam?
The final assignment is the exam, yes.
Okay. And then we don't have the lab and lecture from last week yet, right?
That's correct. I'm gonna record something to cover those topics. It'll be very brief. Those topics will not be part of the final. They're nice topics to cover, but they're not essentials.
Okay, thank you.
So the reason I wanted to cover capital tonight was that is an essential. And I'm sorry I didn't get to it before comps. But but I wanted to make sure that we've covered the essentials, and I believe that we have. The other conversations that will be in the final lecture are more extemporaneous type material. Are there any other questions?
Can you go over the requirements for the paper? Because I know that right now we're doing a lot of other things in other classes, and we have a major project due on the 3rd.
Okay.
So can you go through that? Because right now, I mean, I'm a little worried that I'm not going to have enough time to get a 5-page, 1.5 line paper due between now and May 3rd.
Let me see. I will look at it again, and let me see. I will let you know tomorrow, and I promise this. I will let you know tomorrow about that. I know that my communications have not been very good, but I will take a look at it and see. I have to do something.
Yeah.
So I will figure something. I will look at it again and figure something out.
Would you consider maybe like taking the page count down a couple pages or something along those lines? I mean,
let me take a look at it and see.
Okay.
Let me take a look at it and see.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Any other questions?
Do you?
Sorry, go ahead, Amelia.
I was just gonna ask if there was any other information about the final yet.
There's not, but I will provide an update on that.
My question was similar. I was just sort of wondering what length / amount of time you foresaw that.
My hope with the final is that there will be 2 questions that you will need to answer, and that the length of each question would be about 2 to 3 pages. That
Okay.
would be it.
Thank you.
And the final is like you assign it that day and it's due that same day as well?
No, the final will be distributed on the 26th, and it won't be due until the 5th.
Okay, thank you.
So these questions will be from topics that we already have covered in the course?
Yes. Yes.
Professor Hunter, are we gonna get some feedback on the grading for our lab assignments, or is it just if we turn it into you, we get the points, or?
No, there will be feedback, and I'm trying to get that done as soon as I can.
Okay, thank you.
Professor Hunter, you may have said this at the beginning of class. Is there a lecture next week?
There will be an exam review, but it will be recorded because I have it'll be recorded unless something changes. It will be recorded.
Okay, thank you.
I'm hoping I can change that. If I can change it, I'll let you guys know.
So is this our last class? I'm sorry, I was late.
Yeah, possibly
Our
our
last
lab class. There will be.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
Yeah, this will be our last live class. And then next week, and unless I can work something out to where I would make it live, obviously, I won't know probably until Friday. And once I know on Friday, I'll let you guys know, but I'm not for sure at this point. But one way or another, there will be a class next week. It'll either be live or recorded.
Do you know how long we'll have access to all of the recordings? Like, will that YouTube page just be there?
That's permanent.
Okay, thank you.
That's why I did it on YouTube and not on an internal server. Okay, anything else? Okay, I want to thank everybody for your patience and for your understanding. And I wish you guys the best of luck. And I will be in touch here in a little bit. But thank you all so much and have a good rest of the evening and week.
You too.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.